Daniel Kusrow was born in Bangkok, the son of a United States diplomatic courier. His father was always dragging home airline ephemera from all over the world for his young son. Daniel considers the Washington, D.C. area his home, but now lives on the North Shore of Staten Island in a very large historic Victorian. He is employed as an analyst by the city of New York. Daniel began collecting airline ephemera, primarily posters, then labels, over 30 years ago. He is a longtime member of the World Airline Historical Society and the Ephemera Society of America, and a new member of the AAMS.
As the intro said, I've been collecting labels and stickers and tags and decals for the better part of 30 plus years. I started really with posters, but then really focused on labels, especially living in small New York City apartments. Didn't really construe well to having a bunch of posters hanging around. What we're looking at here is a British magazine on the left that shows the kind of early influences of commercial air transport, and you can see a little bit of some pieces of luggage with labels next to the de Havilland. And on the right is an old album page cover that I got at a stamp show many, many years ago that shows how people dressed up their label albums. A lot of it was homemade, a lot of it was hand-colored and stuff like that, so I find it kind of interesting. What we're looking at here is, on the left, is an image cut out from a magazine called Air Transportation from 1929, which I've had for a number of years. And on the right is basically labels from my collection that are pretty much in the same position. I have to admit that the label at the top, New England Airways, is an Australian airline, and the Yellow Cab Airways in the middle on the original one is obviously an American airline, but that's a very incredibly rare label. I'm still trying to find it out there. Probably take the rest of my life if I ever find it. Starting in the early 1930s, specifically 1933 and the late 1933, were a series of catalogs that were produced called the Martin's Air Transport catalogs. And they were a overview of the hobby as it may be. And really the hobby started as a subset of aerophilately. And it was a way for a lot of people to dress up their flight cover collections and their displays at stamp shows. It's taken me a while to find a bunch of these, but there's the 1934, the 1935 catalogs in the middle, and then the 1937 catalog, which for many, many years was the sole catalog kind of out there until the mid-1970s, actually. And on the right is really a one-of-a-kind label. It came out on eBay about 15 years ago, and it came with some Pan Am postcards. So it's really the first Pan Am label. There is the other Pan Am label, which I showed you in the 1929 view, which is a little bit more larger and colorful, but this is the original Pan Am logo. In 1934, just over 90 years ago, the American Airmail Society did an air label issue. And it was really tied to the issuance of the catalog in 1933. And honestly, it's the only issues where they cover labels in depth. So maybe at some point we'll consider trying to do another issue, maybe a 100th anniversary or something like that. On the right is a very lovely Farman Airlines label, one of the predecessors to Air France. The nice thing about this is it's cloud shaped, it's cut out, dates to about 1930. It's also artist signed. Some were artist signed, but most were not. And this is Albert Salon, who also did a variety of large travel posters over the years, especially for Farman and then Air France. From the Airpost Journal was a section about an airline kind of label listing what airlines were known to issue labels. And there was an illustration in that. It kind of shows you a potpourri of labels that in black and white. And then I've just kind of tried to juxtapose it with the labels now as they are in my collection. Starting in 1941, give or take, the Jackknight Airmail Society was formed in Chicago. Well, I mean, it had been formed before, but it was chapter 23 of the American Airmail Society, is my understanding. But they started to take on an independent kind of focus, one of which was labels, and they had a group called the Air Labels Associates. And starting in the early 40s, they started obviously having a number of stamp shows in Chicago tied to Jackknight, and they even emphasized the fact that they had dealers' bourses and labels. And they also did auctions, and they did new issues of labels, distribution service. And they continued that on into the early part of the 21st century. In the lower left, there was an effort by the Jackknight Airmail Society to do a new set of catalogs, and that started after World War II and continued into the mid-1950s. But for a variety of reasons, I believe related to internal politics, I've gone through a lot of Jackknight Airmail quarterly logs trying to figure this out, but they were never able to kind of get it together. They did a lot of background research. A lot of that was folded into the catalogs that were issued in the 1970s. And then beginning in about 1975 and going through the late 80s, Don Thomas, who was one of the original founders of the Jackknight Airmail Society, he was an active collector of aerophilatelic stuff, and then he went off and did a variety of airline careers, and he worked for the federal government. And then in retirement, he started contributing articles to the Airpost Journal. And the one on the left is his first article from 1975 about the West Indian Aerial Express. And I kind of juxtaposed it with one label I have in my collection. He continued on to another one of my favorite topics, which is Air Marine Airways. And Air Marine's label is quite rare in the lower right. There's probably less than 10 known to exist in any shape. Good shape, maybe 2 or 3. And there's also a previously unknown label, which is from Air Marine West Indies Airways, which was the predecessor to Air Marine Airways. And that dates to about spring of 1921, whereas the Air Marine Airways label was the fall of 1921. By the mid-1970s, the Jackknight Airmail Society and the Aerophilatelic Federation of the Americas was able to basically, under Don's editorial directorship, to put out a series of catalogs in multi-volume set. And they were certainly homemade. Some, and most don't survive in very good shape because they just get beat up over time. But they're a wealth of knowledge. And in fact, Carolyn's father-in-law, Orion Green, actually participated in putting these catalogs together under the auspices of the Jackknight Airmail Society, which at the time had a subgroup called the Aeronautica and Air Label Collectors Club. There were a variety of little smaller philatelic organizations under the larger umbrella group. On the right is a label from Earl Wellman's collection. So you see the front, and then the reverse is back stamped with his collection stamp for the Dutch East Indies KNILM. It's a great Art Deco design, beautiful palm tree with a DC-2 on it. You know, Earl was one of the ones that really, he persevered from the 40s into the mid-70s with Don's help to get these catalogs published. And they're still an incredible reference. Then Don started to move into something that's got going in the mid-70s, which changed the whole focus of kind of the collecting of airline baggage labels, which is the startup of the World Airline Historical Society, which started in 1975. And they started issuing their monthly journal called the Captain's Log. And the society was focused on anything airline collectibles. It wasn't just paper. It just wasn't covers. They ran the gamut from China to barf bags. So, and everywhere in between. And they're still going strong today. But you can see, so this is an issue that Don became the labels editor for the Captain's Log. Don Thomas did. This is from 1985 with the cover of, it's one of the few times that there's an actual baggage label on the Captain's Log covers. And you can see the design pictured at the right in color, with also variants, which included Mexicana with a Ford Tri-Motor, and then Penair do Brazil and Flying Boat, which was, the Flying Boat's kind of a combination of an S40 and an S42. It's more an artist representation. On the left is actually a picture of Don Thomas at the Airliners International show, which was actually in Newport. It says Los Angeles in '82. So every year they have a large convention called AI, Airliners International, and rotates from cities. They started in '78 and are going strong next year. This year is going to be in Kansas City. And last one I was in Chicago at 2022. Now, Don had such a huge collection of labels. What he would do is literally come to a show and just pile a huge grouping of labels on the table, and people just sat there and sifted through labels for hours and hours, and he sold them very reasonably. So that was sort of a photo, an homage to him, where I'm sifting through labels at another table about 40 years later. I know in going through the Airpost journals that there was an article done not too long ago in the Christmas issue about the Interstate Airlines Christmas flight in 1929. And I included this. This is a cover from my collection. What's interesting about it to me, and I only actually found out anything about it with respect to the Air Post Journal in 1934 actually highlighted it. The recipient of the letter was a gentleman by the name of George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman was a longtime stamp and aerophilatelic specialist and collector. He was also the real name of one S.F. Martin, who published the airline baggage labels catalogs from the 1930s, authored them and researched them. So that was his pen name, S.F. Martin. And the other label that's below it is actually the rare label for Interstate, the giant eye with Hermes holding up the biplane. And on the right, we have a series. It's an original cover and it's original label. These were put together by Lou Fischbach. He had a huge, phenomenal cover and label collect. The cam caches on the back, so you had room on the front to basically put a label on it. They're both original. They're just not done in the original period, shall we say. But they're kind of fun and very colorful. We're going to look at labels over kind of a decades over the last 100 years. And really the earliest I have is Daylog, which is on the left, which is really essentially an oversized poster stamp showing their routes, which was more tourist flying routes around Germany and tied to Hamburg America Line. On the right is not anything to do with labels per se. They look like labels, but they're actually airline tickets from 1919 from Farman between Brussels and Paris, or Paris, Brussels, Brussels, Paris. They almost look like certificates, and they're one of the earliest international airline tickets I've ever seen. So my collection includes a lot of other pieces of ephemera besides just labels. Moving into the 20s, and I have over 10,000 labels. So, I mean, I've tried to pick out interesting ones, but they're obviously airlines I may have missed, aircraft I may have missed, so I apologize in advance. And I'm happy to share any of them with people if they're interested later on. On the left is the predecessor to Aeropostale. That's a very, very rare label for their initial services into North Africa. The NERBA label with the trimotor, which plays out the whole concept of its original name, is Trimotor Safety Airways, which actually that aircraft never had a third engine on it, even though it's depicted on one. The label was printed in Argentina. It was also appeared on a flight cover in a 1993 cover picture from the APJ. The label in the upper right for Transadriatica, which pioneered service between Venice and Vienna, is an oversized label. It's almost like a trunk label. It's the only one I've ever seen with the griffin on there. And I've shared it with people in Venice, and they've never seen it before. It's very thin tissue paper, too, and that's why a lot of labels don't survive, because they're very delicate. In stone, sort of a shout-out to Imperial Airways. I did have an Imperial label before on the Martin catalog, but that was in fairly poor shape. They would glue on labels to kind of help decorate the catalogs. Instone was one of the predecessors to Imperial, Handley Page, Instone, and Daimler, and another small operation called British Aeromarine. I also try to find pictures of labels actually in use, and I was very lucky to find the picture on the left, which is Air Union, another predecessor to Air France. You have two stewards unloading a Farman Goliath at Croydon in about 1925. And as you can see on the hat boxes, the label is there, quite visible, the Air Union label in the lower left corner. And it's also in the little suitcase sitting on the side of the plane. And then I move on to Handley Page, another predecessor to Imperial Airways, another very rare label. And I have a trunk with one of their original labels on it, which with a bunch of other hotel labels. I like to see stuff in use too, even though it's in not very good shape or faded or split. Into the 30s, the label for Lon Chile at the top is interesting because it shows a Ford trimotor, which they never flew. I guess the artist who designed the label was probably inspired by Bonagra, but that's just a raw supposition. It's in what I would argue is probably poor shape, but it's the only one I've ever seen over 30 years. And I've talked to some serious Lon Chile people in the UK, and they've never seen it either. American Airlines, right after the airmail scandal and with their Kurdish Condor sleeping service, one of the first in the US to encourage overnight air travel. A very rare early Misair label for Egypt with the pyramids down at the bottom with the de Havilland. And then I have a Graf Zeppelin level. I always had to throw in my favorite aerial travelers, Clara Adams, that she signed. I have a number of labels signed by her. This is an interesting set. I know it's kind of a broad tableau, shall we say, but it's German flying boats operated by Italian airline across the Adriatic through northern Italy along the eastern coast of Italy. They're just incredibly colorful, and they've been referenced even in the 1934 APJ issue as being incredibly colorful. So we look at them another 90 years on. I'm missing a couple, but it's hard to find them all. It just takes a long time. These are very, very obscure and very, very rare. What they are is Manchurian Air Transport or Manchuria Aviation Company labels from occupied Manchuria, Japanese airline operating in Manchuria from the early 1930s through World War II. There's only one of them that's actually in English, which is the one with the winged next to the right of the triangle, the red triangle. It says Manchuria Aviation Company. The rest of them are in, I believe, Chinese, pretty sure. And there's a small ticket envelope in the lower right corner. So it's a large set. It's taken me a lot of time to put together. Into the 40s, we have kind of the petty girl image of the TWA stewardess uniform, late 40s in front of the Constellation. Nice SAS label for services to New York right after the war. Early American export service for the VS-44 from New York City to Foynes, Ireland during the war label. And then a non-sched label. I have some non-scheduled carriers labels. Sometimes it's the only thing that survives of some of the non-sched stuff are labels. And Veterans Airline is the one I'm showing. These are an interesting set of labels. They're destination labels for an airline called Airways India, which ultimately became part of the domestic carrier Indian Airlines in the early 50s. These date to the late 40s, right around the time of partition. They're all on tissue paper. They're all irregular in terms of size and how they're trimmed down and stuff, but they're kind of very colorful and interesting with the destinations. Into the 50s, I obviously have a piece for Pan Am, their introduction to the jets. I also have a Sabina ran their Sikorsky helicopter service from Brussels to Paris in the 50s. I'm a big fan of the series of notepads. These are all pieces of note paper that were done by TWA. They're shrunken posters. They are lithographed like the posters. There's about 65 of them, and this is the one from Manhattan. To give you a perspective, that poster today in a poster version is about $10,000. But you can get a label for $20, $30. That's kind of the fun of it. And then Capital Airlines air coach service to Atlanta. Into the 60s, you can certainly see the modern 60s effect taking place in the design. Continental, there's an interesting label for Haiti, for Kohata, a small domestic carrier. Some early jet service at CSA, and a great 707 label for Varig. Into the 70s, I go back to Antilles Airboats, which I have the American Export Airways connection to, which ultimately Antilles Airboats ended up with some of their flying boats, at least one of the VS-44s, and Charlie Blair's airline. What's funny is it's obviously a mallard, and then you've got a mallard sitting on the back of the fuselage. Early British Airways, just after formation, amalgamation with BEA and BOAC. I have a number of airlines labels besides the Sabina, but I also have for KLM, served oil exploration facilities in the North Sea. And then Freddie Laker's SkyTrain, which was certainly a thing of the future, probably about a couple decades too early for budget airlines across the Atlantic. Into the 80s, you have some great graphics from Air France advertising their 50th anniversary with a bit of a Concorde tail. I've got a bunch of stuff on Eastern Europe, but there's kind of an interesting Malev label. A lot of labels, some are done in a metallic design, metallic paper. They're kind of making an interesting effect. They shimmer. Abstract design for 737 and also an abstract design for an L1011 with inaugural service to Singapore. A lot of labels in the modern era are really being generated to commemorate a new aircraft, commemorate new services, to commemorate an anniversary. And you can see essentially 3 of those labels on here, which by this time, they're almost what we're calling stickers. Labels to me are something that had either a plain paper back or they had adhesive back. Sometimes what people would do is use a wheat paste glue and stick them onto luggage. Self stickers are, you crack open the sticker and you can just have it stick on its own. Into the 90s, we have LAPA, which was a budget airline that flew from Argentina to Atlanta, not for very long. LAN Chile, with service to Easter Island, great long route. Lufthansa in the middle did a bunch of series of labels in the 1980s and 90s, very kind of tied to almost their photographic postcards. And this one's just interesting, kind of myriad of images, Australian, Thai, 747-400. And then another example of an anniversary. This is interesting, the 50th anniversary of North Atlantic service of Swiss Air between Geneva and New York. They actually got a DC-4 in 97 and painted it up in Swiss Air colors and flew across it. It was a very expensive flight and very long, but it was cool. Into the 2000s, now we're really looking at airlines advertising new planes coming. Obviously, Ethiopian was taking delivery of the 787. The Dreamliner, which actually didn't come till about 3 years after that label was printed up. Qantas was advertising their A380. JetBlue was still doing some very creative graphics. And Alaska was, obviously pushing their all 737 fleet. And Accenture, which is a thin cardboard baggage tag. Into the early 2010s, we have an A350 and essentially an A220. Again, from African airlines, one's for Kenya and Ethiopian. And an interesting sticker set from Lufthansa. You're starting to see a lot of the European airlines do this more aggressively than the American carriers. It's almost like a graphic worksheet, different stickers, cutouts of aircraft, and logo designs. And into the modern era, the last of the modern era. So several with the 737 MAXs on them for Cape Verde Airlines and Mauritania Airlines, of which they literally flew, each of them have one of them, not a big fleet of them, but they got a sticker as a result. Japan Airlines still aggressively issues stickers for all its new aircraft, and they were very proud of their participation in the World Rugby Tournament, so they got a rugby ball in 2023. The one at the right is actually sort of an interesting outlier. It reflects modern society. So they're not really baggage labels anymore. They're called tech tattoo. So they're stickers for your laptop, your phones, your iPad, whatever. And this is advertising. This is brand new. This is advertising for the 2024 Olympics coming up in Paris. So I'm paying a little homage to my old man here, my father, who was a diplomatic courier for 25 years, which basically means the government paid him to fly to every country on the planet. He flew about 130 different airlines, won about 8 million miles in his career. The little two tags at the lower right for Cameroon Airlines, I got from one of his coworkers. So those were actually on diplomatic pouches. And they were Cameroon Airlines to Geneva, Chad. Only the couriers would fly something like that. When I was growing up, we moved around a lot overseas and we would airship stuff. So Pan Am did like Clipper cargo for unaccompanied baggage, which is essentially household items going to a diplomatic post. They even did a little anniversary sticker for the courier service in 1968. And then SAS did a diplomatic bag label. That's probably from the 50s. And that's more for the courier wasn't escorting the pouch. The pouch was just sitting in the cockpit with the flight crew. But it was segregated from the regular passenger load, baggage load passengers. What I'm kind of concluding here is how labels have evolved into different areas, baggage labels. Because of my research and participating in some websites that display labels, I was invited by Louis Vuitton to basically date the labels in this reproduction set that they did. And Gaston Louis Vuitton, which was the grandson of the founder, was a big label collector, hotels, ocean liner, railroad, and airline. And this is from their corporate archives. So I worked on this set. I've also participated in a book, which is generally, it's kind of a funny title, Stickers Volume 2, More Stuck-Up Crap. It's really more punk stickers, but the guy I knew who wrote this book's like, oh, we want to include some classic stickers in it, labels in the year of travel. So I ended up doing a couple pages on hotel labels, which I have some, and ocean liner and railroad, and a bunch of airline labels, which include some other rare labels, like the first Western Air Express on the upper right from about 1926, a larger Handley Page label from about 1919, One of my favorite labels of Air France. I love the flying seahorse dragging bags of cargo in the air. First American Airways label, which is the light beacon. There's probably only like 4 copies of that label known. I really like the Yeti service for Royal Nepal Airlines, their premier service, the Yeti, serving you. Avianca's fun with the flight attendant who has the ocelot in front of her. A fairly scarce Pan Am label, basically advertising the Lindbergh route around the Caribbean from about 1929, 30. And a pretty scarce TWA label in the lower left for right after the World War II, probably 47, 48, showing their entire global route, which showed them going as far as China. I was involved in the Ephemera Society of America, which kind of took its existence from the British Ephemera Society, and started around 1979. They do an encyclopedia of an ephemera, and there's a whole section on air transport labels. And this is me. This is some contact information for me. I'm Daniel Kusrow. I run a display site of airline baggage labels, and I can certainly answer anybody's questions about it. And I hope you enjoyed your flight and the presentation.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yes, please.
Don Thomas published a series of books of labels, all in color.
Correct.
I don't know how many there were, about 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah, there was Nostalgia Pan Americana. There was he did stuff on posters. He did there was 5 of them, I think.
Yeah, those were really nice books.
Yeah. I've got them all inscribed by Don to Earl Wellman's son, Fred Wellman. So yeah, they're a great set. They actually inspired me a lot. I talked to Don once on the phone, but I got in just as he passed effectively.
Yeah, I stayed with him when he lived in St. John in the Virgin Islands, and then he later moved to Coral Gables, Florida.
He went to Coral Gables, and then he was in Dunedin.
Then he lived in Dunedin on the west.
Dunedin. Yeah.
So I visited him in all those places.
Don's sort of an inspiration for me. I mean, the reality is that I was the editor, the labels and stickers editor for the Captain's Log of the World Airline Historical Society. So when Don Thomas was the first, David Rowe was the second, and I was the third.
You also collect airmail etiquettes?
I do. I actually have a fair number of etiquettes. I didn't really focus on them this much. Most of my etiquettes are really, I like the airline issued ones over just the governmental issued ones. But yeah, because some of them are very rare in themselves.
Any other comments for Daniel?
Yes, if I could, Daniel.
Yes.
My name's Chester Browning. I live in Rhode Island. A very good friend of mine passed away 4 years ago, Arthur Carter, who's a member of a lot of the national organizations. And for the past 4 years, I've been curating his collection. 300,000 photos, 300 boxes of memorabilia, and I have several binders of labels. And right now I think I've totaled out about 275 labels that are in a collection itself. Then I've got multiples as well. I was very pleased to see that you were going to speak tonight, and I presume the best way to address some of the items in the collection would be to either email you at your home address or through air baggage labels.
Yeah. And in fact, if you go to airlinebaggagelabels.com, there's an email address on there, which is effectively the email address that I have under my name displayed on the screen. So you can reach me, essentially at a location. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Great.
That's a huge project.
It's only taken me 4 years. Arthur, like your father, he was a government agent for the highway department. Started collecting in like 1937 when he was 10. And I have files with letters to each of the airlines requesting baggage tags, labels, and so forth. And it just accumulated. I think he was inclusive with probably about 5 or 6 million miles he traveled with the government, and I've got all his plaques from the various organizations.
Right.
But it's
Well,
cool.
I didn't really get into it, but in terms of my own biography, but my dad's dad also worked in commercial aviation, except much earlier. He started with the Navy in 32, and then he worked for United Airlines in 35, 36 on a range station in the middle of high desert Colorado, basically. And then he ended up basically working air traffic control in the West. He worked at Salt Lake City Airport in the late 30s, at San Diego Airport in the late 30s. He then went on to CAA, and he was posted with CAA out throughout the West, setting up air traffic control systems all through the West. And then he went to Honduras in the mid-50s to set up stuff in Tegucigalpa and retired out of Washington. So I guess airlines are kind of buried deep in my blood.
I worked in the airline industry for 40 years.
Well,
Never heard of you, Ken.
I've actually heard of you, Ken. So
I know.
Also mentioned Don Thomas. He was a radio operator for Pan Am
yeah, he was.
during the
Yeah, for
World War
Pan
II
Africa and
Africa flights, supporting the military.
yeah. Well, then he went on and had a career basically doing the same thing with the CIA.
Right.
No, that's stuff that I certainly understood, from growing up as a kid, from what I did too.
So just as an add-on, Daniel, the Encyclopedia of Ephemera.
Yeah.
And is there any other catalogs currently on baggage labels and tags and such?
Well, I mean, the catalogs were, again, they were issued between, the first editions of the modern catalogs were issued between 1975 and about 1978 in various groupings across different geographic regions. And then they were updated all the way up until just before Don passed, which was in 95.
Mm-hmm.
And then David Rowe did some addendums in the late 90s and 2000s, but that's the only thing that's been done up to that point, and since then. And unfortunately, they're not readily available. I mean, they pop up on eBay and they pop up on used book sites. And like the one I showed you was a set that came from a dealer that I just happened to, if I see them, I literally will buy extra sets just to have, to give to somebody or encourage somebody, or because there is a whole new generation of collectors in this stuff that had nothing to do with aerophilately. I mean, I was just at the Allentown Paper Show this past weekend, and there were a lot of airline labels there, and I bought some stuff for some other people, but they're interested. Some are interested in aerophilately, but some are interested just in the graphics of it, and the design history of it. It's kind of transcended. And some of the prices that are being realized in some of these labels are kind of even mind-blowing for me, who's been dealing with this stuff for 35 years. I mean, I'm primarily a collector, but like many people, you end up also kind of buying and selling, because it's just the nature of the beast, I guess.
Really enjoyed your presentation, Daniel. I wish I could have had my daughter on this call tonight, because she talks about the Greater Philly Stamp Club as the fancy sticker club. So she would have enjoyed the sticker catalog you showed at the very end there. So, but really enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, well, that's sort of a weird story in itself. But the guy who wrote it was actually one of my former clients in Brooklyn before I worked for the city, and he was a DJ. He is a DJ, and their whole thing was like, oh, we love rock stickers, we love club stickers, we love this, and then I was talking to him about my airline stuff. He's like, mate, he's a British DJ. He's like, mate, we're going to get you in the book. And that's how I got stuck in there. But that was just cool. It got put up by Rizzoli, so I can actually walk into a bookstore in the United States and look at a book that I sort of participated in. So I take some modicum of pride in that.
Daniel?
Yeah,
I somehow acquired master copies of the latest catalog updates for the baggage labels. And
David Rose?
I don't know who did them. I have not looked at them in great detail, but let me spend some time
in the next couple of weeks going through that, and I'll contact you and let me know what I think I have.
That would be helpful. I mean, the problem with the catalogs also is they just were repetitively photocopied. So as the catalogs got older and older, the images got darker and darker.
Right.
So
and these have some sort of a plasticized image.
Yeah, they had like this sort of weird mimeograph thing going on in Elgin. And I know a little bit about that. I've heard some of it because that's where the Jackknight Airmail Society offices were, and they would crank them out there. That's why, like, I've bought first editions of the catalogs from the 70s, so I can at least look at images and actually see them, as opposed to 1993, they're black. But it's just sort of, again, the way it is.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'll look at these over the next couple of weeks and get a hold of you.
All right, that's cool. Yeah,
let you know what I've got.
Well, I hope people have enjoyed it. It's a fun way of looking at stuff, and I've seen a lot of comments over the years, and even like from the 1934 issue of the APJ, they're like, "Wow, people actually looked at the labels more than my flight covers." I'm like, okay, but
well, the art is just so fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the artists are really unsung. I mean, on the hotels, there's more known artists that got involved, but some of the airline stuff is pretty obscure. The French stuff was pretty good. They were really respectful of the artists. They would throw their names on there, but it's whatever. The designs, I mean, they're reflective of the period of the graphic history of that given period. Today, yeah, there are labels and tags that are used all the time by airlines, but they're just barcodes.
Right.
I mean, you see them on flight bags, of crew bags and stuff like that. And some of the European carriers and some of the Asian carriers are very good about putting them out. It's sort of a cult thing. But then I was surprised to see the whole tech tattoo thing with Delta. Like, who knew Delta was going to do that?
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, but it's sort of reflective of, like, what are people into stickers for? We want to dress up our laptops or our iPads. Okay.
Yeah, not what I want to do.
I mean, I work in technology, and no, that's not what I want to do. But it's kind of cool. We still surviving in some weird dimension.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe the new younger generation will get into it.
Well, yeah. Well, that's what they're encouraging, because people do get very into that kind of stuff. I mean, I see a lot of people dress up stuff and have corporate logos or game logos or what have you. And again, that's sort of reflected in that stickers book that I participated in. But it was funny. I met the designer who laid out the book, and she's like, "Well, your stuff was really good." It was fun to work with.
I'd like to clear something up. My father-in-law lived in Florida near Fort Lauderdale from about 1950 to 1990. And he, I know, worked with John Thomas. I thought it was in the Fort Lauderdale area. Am I wrong?
Well, they might have known each other, because Fort Lauderdale is not that far from Coral Gables when Don lived there. I mean, Don didn't move into the Florida area, I think, and correct me, Ken, if I'm wrong, because he was still working for the government, and he was serving in various posts overseas until he retired. And I don't think that happened until the early 1970s.
About the 70s, okay.
So, I mean, maybe they had connections starting then. I mean, now that's not to say they weren't corresponding, and through the Jackknight Society, because Don was, I know, a member throughout that, because I see him in membership roles. I literally bought a complete run of the Jackknight Airmail Society from the guys in Elgin before they closed up shop. And I went through it page by page by page, looking for just history. It's the only place you could find that kind of history. That's why I have a sense and sensibility of the catalog effort that they tried to do in the 1940s into the 50s. And there were people that got so upset they left because they couldn't get it together and put out a catalog. But they had these very in-depth cards, rating cards, and they did images, and they said, well, how many people have this? And, it was a group effort, because they would sit around and say, okay, they would canvass 12, 15, 20 super collectors and say, how many do you have this? How many do you have this? And they say, well, we have 10. Okay, so the constellation's 10 times 10, 100. Or, that's how they were coming up with the rarity. they're not officially tracked and issued. And a lot of airlines went through multiple printings of stuff. Or like the interstate airlines, the giant eye next to the Christmas cover, that, once the airline got folded into American, all the labels that were there were then immediately destroyed. It's kind of like, okay, well, you just went from being a bunch of them to like 10 of them. And a lot of the early airmail pilots I've found out were kind of also label collectors themselves. They set up boards in airports and they'd bring in labels and they'd trade them and display them. And some of the first displays were done in 1927 in Chicago at a hotel that had like a travel office, and they would put them up and people would just stare at them in the window. This was exciting stuff, especially tied to Lindbergh's flight and so forth, and the new dynamic growth of commercial aviation in the United States. Because before 1927, the only thing going really was, there were small operations, but really of any significance was my other favorite, which is Air Marine. And there were thousands of labels printed to that. Harry Bruno was involved with the design of that label. And like I said, there's like 10 known to survive. Some of them are in really just bits and pieces or severely faded and stained. Because some of them were literally taken off pieces of old luggage.
Right.
And I know that's even from like my dealings with the folks at Louis Vuitton. Like they get luggage back in that is refurbished. That's why their stuff can last so long. They're people send stuff back to have it Louis Vuitton will still work on luggage that's 100 years old. Cost you a lot of money and take a long time, but they'll still work on it. And they'll scrape off luggage and stickers and stuff like that and, make it look new again.